Hi, welcome back to the Style Sessions. I'm Roger Mittag. I'm the founder of Prud'homme Beer Certification, and I am really excited to have this session with you today. This is one of my favorite styles. It's a very complex style. It's not because I drink it all the time, it's because I drink it sporadically, but I'm in awe of how it's made and the different kinds that you can get. So first of all, what is it? It's Lambic. Lambic is a geographical protection, or in other words, an appellation. And in the wine world, there are tons of geographical protections. In the beer world, not so many. And Lambic is maybe one of the most important ones. And so I'm going to give you a bit of background on the style in a minute, but we're going to split this into two sessions. The first session is we're going to talk about what Lambic beer is, how it's actually made, talk about the geographical protection and appellation for a little bit, and discuss one particular type of Lambic, and that is this. This is called a Gueuze Lambic. And the one that we're going to feature today is from, it's called Bretel, and it's from a brewery called Lambic Fabrique out of just in the vicinity of Brussels. So what I'm going to do, as we always do, is I'm going to pour the beer first. We're going to talk about the attributes of a Gueuze, and then I'm going to get into a little bit more about what the appellation is. So first of all, what you should know is if you ever get a chance to buy a Lambic beer, they could come in a variety of different bottles. They're always going to be in bottles, just guaranteed that. Some will have cap only, like this. Some will have what this one had, and that is a cork and a cap. Now the reason the cork and the cap are in there is the cork allows some of the carbon dioxide to dissipate, and that is for beers that are re-fermented or bottle conditioned. Not all Lambics are bottle conditioned, so you have to be aware of that. Once you open it, you may need a corkscrew to get it out. Others have corks and cages on them, so a wire mesh cage that holds that cork in so that it doesn't explode in transit. This is a really, really cool style. I first was introduced to this style in 1997 in the Bellevue Brewery in Brussels. It was an amazing experience. I had never ever had a Gueuze before, and it just blew my mind. So let me pour it for you, and we'll talk a little bit about this particular one. So this one I have turned it upside down and moved it around so that I get all the yeast in here. This is such a beautiful beer. You can see that it poured really nice. It's got this big white frothy foam on the top, and it's perfectly cloudy. Like, it's a really nice, you can't see a thing through it. Color-wise, I would describe this as peach and apricot or golden in color. It's definitely cloudy. It's got this really nice white frothy foam. And the thing about Lambic beers, and especially Gueuzes, is they remind me of champagne. So they have the same kind of effervescence, so you should always expect good sparkle out of these beers. But the other thing about this is you get mild characteristics of apple. And with Lambic beers, because of the way that they're produced, the apple is more tart. There are sour characteristics in Lambic beers, and especially Gueuzes, so you should expect some acidity and some sourness on here. But tart apple or crab apple is what I like to explain to people. The other thing about Lambics, because of the way that they're brewed, there's always a mustiness. And sometimes we view mustiness as being not an appropriate way of describing beers, but I can assure you that when you talk about barn and farm and old wood and old apple cellars, like that mustiness that's in there, it elicits great memories of maybe your grandparents' place or somebody that you knew in a rural community. It's a really, really nice, comforting smell for me. You might get a little bit of spice note on here as well, so a little bit of pepper is always in a Gueuze as well. And white pepper is part of the Belgian yeast strains, so you always get a little bit of spice characteristic in there. And then when you taste it, what you're going to experience is a really, really fast finish, and then the acidity comes out. Then you're going to get some of the sourness. It's going to be extremely dry too. So dryness, as I've said earlier, is great to stimulate your thirst, because when your mouth is dry, you're going to want a little bit more. Man, it's so good. Yeah, really, really tart, like a tart apple. It's got some nice souring characteristics. So now that I've had a sip of this, flavor profile is going to be very similar. You're going to get all that apple and that sourness in there. They are thirst quenchers. They're meant to be served cold. Let me tell you a little bit about Lambics so that you can understand a little bit more about them. Lambic beers are protected by royal decree in Belgium, and they are brewed in a 15 square kilometer radius surrounding Brussels. The river that runs through that area is called the Seine River, and it is an area that in Belgium is referred to the Pajottenland. And this is a very crucial area. There are quite a few old breweries there, but it is very important to Belgian beer culture. So this is the critical piece about Lambic brewing, in that it is probably the oldest form of brewing that we know. Now, having said that, it's the oldest form of fermentation, but not necessarily brewing, because all these Lambic brewers that are out there right now are brewing with modern techniques. They're using modern kettles, modern mash tuns. They're going through the exact same process that any modern brewer would go, and then once they've finished cooling the wort down before it goes into fermentation, that's where things change. And they change like this. This is where you let nature take its course. So when the wort is cooled, it goes up into the fermenting vessels. The fermenting vessels are generally in the top of the brewery, and they are open to the air. They are long and rectangular, and they're open to the air. And then the brewery opens all the windows and the doors in the brewery and allows the yeast to come in naturally from the fields adjacent. This brewing process only takes place between October and May. That's when the time and the temperature is correct for all the yeast to come in from the fields. And the yeast that we see dominating in Lambic beers is a yeast strain called Prud'homme. You might hear them as being called Bretts. Bretts are an extremely interesting yeast strain because they are considered to be wild. And if Bretts get into a modern brewery, it destroys all the rest of the yeast, and it makes your beers get that funky, musty kind of characteristic to it. So we want to be very protective of this kind of a yeast strain. The other thing with Prud'homme is they're extremely long fermentation processes. This is not something that happens in 3, 4 days, 7 days, 10 days like ale and lager yeast. This can sometimes take months. And then once the fermentation process is finished, then the beer gets moved into wooden barrels. And the barrels are sometimes centuries old. They're typically port or wine barrels. And then the beer then gets aged in there from anywhere from 6 months to 6 years. So it's an extremely long process. Now, to make a true Lambic beer, you're going to age it and then blend it. So the key role in the brewery is not necessarily the brewer, but it is the blender. And blenders take a long time to get their nose and their palates attuned to that particular brewery and what their style is associated with. So it takes a long time to get this right. So all the time they're looking at blending things. And that's what creates the consistency in these Lambic beers, is the blending itself. It is a fascinating type of beer to actually produce. It's very, very complex. It takes months and years to produce these things properly, and we don't get a lot of them in our area of the world. And in Canada specifically, they are few and far between. It depends on what province you're in. In the United States, again, it depends on which state you're in and what that distributor can actually bring in. But there are some wonderful Lambic beers that are out there, and this is a goose. So what I'd like to do is give you a toast, and hopefully we'll see you for the second session, in which we're going to talk about fruit lambics, farrows, and bière de Mars. Cheers.